Hello, my name is Mira Funk, licensed clinical social worker. Welcome to my YouTube channel and also my podcast, which I'm going to put up on Spotify. So, this is the very first episode. So this is an introduction to the channel and to the podcast. And I thought I would begin by just saying a bit about me and my life story and my background and how I come to do the work that I do. So, my story starts in childhood, a very unhappy childhood, honestly. There was a lot of difficulty in my home growing up. My dad was serially unfaithful. My mom, there was a very difficult divorce. I had a lot of health problems as a child, which I'll say more about. And I was just really depressed. I was really lost, really depressed. I also was raised in a fundamentalist Christian household, and I was a queer kid. I didn't realize that at the time, but I was raised as a cisgender straight boy, and that was not who I was, which I discovered later, and I'll say more about that. And so yeah, it was really difficult. But I think honestly, the pieces on the medical side that made my life the hardest for me were a couple of traumas, medical traumas that I experienced. One was a febrile seizure. So when I was 8 years old, I had strep throat and I was given penicillin. And neither my mom nor I knew that I was allergic to penicillin. And I had this just really out of control allergic reaction that resulted in this febrile seizure. And I have to hear the story from my mom because I was unconscious. So basically what happened was one night after she gave me the medicine, she was watching a movie and she heard this thump, 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 this like pounding sound. And she thought, what's going on? Is the washing machine on? Is there, what's going, and she realizes that this sound is coming from my bedroom. And she rushes in, opens the door, and she finds me blue and bloody, totally unconscious, seizing violently. And yeah, I basically had this this grand mal seizure. And she immediately calls 911. The paramedics come and they tell her, your kid probably has pretty significant brain damage because, they've been without oxygen for a long time. They're cyanotic, they're blue. And so, yeah, that there was a possibility that I might have just been seriously brain damaged. And fortunately, I came to, and I went back home, and I was given kind of a bill of clean health from the doctor. But I don't think that I really fully recovered. I do think it left some kind of lasting damage. I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but I just know after that, I started to have a lot more difficulties neurocognitively, emotionally. There's also this kind of confounding factor of the fact that I, at some point in my childhood, acquired both Lyme disease and something called babesia, which is a co-infection of Lyme. It's a blood parasite that has pretty significant neurological symptoms. And so it's hard to say whether it was the febrile seizure, whether it was the Lyme, combination of the two. But at some point when I was around, 8, 9, 10, and my mom kind of confirms this for me, that I started to complain about all these symptoms, especially neurological symptoms. So this feeling in my head, I still have it right now. I've had it my entire life as far as I can remember of, this kind of this headache and it's more of like almost like a foggy burning sensation, almost like my head is full of cotton balls and chili powder. It's just really, really uncomfortable. It makes it hard to think. It makes me feel really disconnected. And it's very, very challenging, like a chronic condition. And yeah, I think as a result of all those different things, I just really felt very depressed, disconnected. I had a lot of challenges as a child, behaviorally, with anger. I had a lot of like potty training issues, accidents at school and embarrassing episodes and things like that. And I was just really kind of lost, and it didn't really resolve. As I went into middle school, high school, and the depression got worse. I became suicidal. I just always felt like there was a veil between me and the world, and I was always just sort of one beat behind. And I knew there was just something wrong with me. I didn't know what it was, but I just had this sense of being damaged in some way. And yeah, I somehow developed this passion for academics through all that, and maybe it was some kind of, I don't know, overcompensation. I think I had a sense of, um, yeah, neurological challenges, and so I kind of threw myself into my studies. Maybe it was also trying to compensate for a feeling of emptiness I felt, or inadequacy because of my dad forsaking our family in a sense, with all of his infidelities and the difficulties of the divorce. I felt that he was still around, but there was this feeling of like he's left our family emotionally, and that left this wound in me that I was trying to fill with the attaboys, the accolades of academic achievement. So I really threw myself into my studies and just got really burned out. And when I went to college, which was at Harvard, I had this naive hope that everything's going to be better because now I'm leaving, Dallas behind. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and I'm going to Boston. I'm going to be a new person. But of course, that didn't prove to be true. And when I got to Harvard, I got really, really burned out, and I just hit a wall. Absolutely. And I had to have some help. So I called some family who are in New Hampshire, and I went and lived on this farm in Roxbury, New Hampshire, this little tiny town near Keene. And yeah, that was a really difficult time for me. I was really depressed. I was journaling obsessively, really lost, trying to just kind of get back into my body and doing simple farm chores. And I had this interesting thing happen to me where I was just shoveling horse manure, and I was so just heavy laden with all these uncertainties about whether I was going to go back to college, what I was going to do with my life. And just for a moment, I was just shoveling horse manure. My mind was just clear. And then all of a sudden, all the thoughts came back in, and I felt really heavy again. And I noticed that little gap, and I thought, well, that's interesting. What is that? And I remember Googling around on my laptop at the time and seeing something about Zen Buddhism and this kind of don't know mind or not knowing mind. And I thought, well, this is intriguing. I'm trying so hard to know what the next step is for me. But if I just drop into this not knowing, there's some kind of clarity, there's some kind of relief. And so that got me really interested in Buddhism. I already had some interest in Buddhism going back to high school, but that just really propelled it forward for me. And I remember I went to this local Zen group in New Hampshire, which was kind of a little satellite group of the Kwan Um school of Zen. And there was a teacher there, and I was asking him all these questions, and he kept answering my questions in this way that felt like it was coming from a different place, a place that was not cognitive, but was some like koan, like, right? Just like challenging my minds to open up. And that was also really intriguing. So I finally went back to college, and I practiced more seriously at the Cambridge Zen Center. I started doing retreats, and just, I really became passionate about Zen Buddhism. But I definitely hit another wall emotionally when I was in, my junior year of college. I just remember, again, just feeling really burned out in academics, just feeling like, I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't know, what is the next step for me in my life. And just feeling really disillusioned and the sense of existential angst. And I had this idea that if I could just go to Korea and just really go really, really deep into Zen and spend some time in a monastery, maybe I'll sort all these things out. And of course, I was planning all this in a really kind of intellectual way. And so I brought some Heidegger with me, and I had this idea that I was going to meditate and I was going to think really hard about philosophy and figure everything out in this kind of cognitive, intellectual way. And it was hard for me. That was a very, very hard time. I was there for 3 months, 2 months of really intensive practice, 1 month of lighter practice, although you're still getting up at 3 a.m. every day and doing a lot of meditation. And I remember just feeling so regressed. I also did a long fast, water-only fast for about 17 days. I had this idea that I was trying to heal my body and my mind, and by whatever means necessary, anything I needed to do. And so I would just meditate for hours, and I would fast. And during the fast in particular, I just really regressed almost to a childlike state. I even remember getting some kind of calling card and like calling my mom from this phone that was on the monastery campus, sort of at the edge of it, and just being almost like a child, just being like, can you pray for me? And that was something that I had left Christianity long behind for years, but I just felt so needy, so vulnerable that I wanted to go back to that sense of childlike comfort of needing my mother to comfort me. And so I was just, I was in this really, really deep state of depression, regression, hopelessness, desperation. And finally, I finished the fast, which helped. And in retrospect, I think I was trying to heal the Lyme disease. I knew there was something wrong with my body. I didn't know what it was because I just received this diagnosis recently. But the fasting actually made things worse, and actually really messed up my digestive system, which is a whole another saga. So it was really hard. And I did notice, though, with all the hours of meditation, that my mind started to settle, and I started to have at least some traction with meditation and some sense of clarity. But that existential angst that I went in with, I still had at the end of these 3 months. And I remember, I think it was maybe the day before I was going to leave and go back home, I approached the resident Zen master. We were at the local bathhouse together. And I asked him, I've been meditating so much, and I feel like I've had all these insights, but I still have this gnawing existential angst. I just don't know why I'm meditating. I don't know what the point of any of this is or what the point of life is. Like, please, can you help me? And he just was, scrubbing himself with a brush and some kind of mugwort tea bath or something. I can't remember which part of the bathhouse we were in, and he just said, sounds like too much thinking. And it sounds very kind of matter of fact, but it just hit my mind so hard, because in my meditation practice, I had been training myself to not give so much weight to what I considered sort of frivolous thinking. So if I'm sitting on the meditation cushion in Korea and my mind is looping about, I don't know, like what I'm going to have for lunch in the dining hall when I go back to Harvard, which just seems absurd because it's just so irrelevant to what I'm doing in that moment. Okay, I can let go of that thought because that's, chewing on that feels like a waste of energy. But when an existential thought, a philosophical thought came up, that would be, really, really tantalizing for my mind. I think, oh, that's important. I need to kind of stew on that and chew on that and ruminate. And it never occurred to me that actually the underlying process is the same, that if you're attached to thinking, regardless of what the content of the thought is, there's some kind of problematization that's happening. There's this overcomplication, complexification of the mind that's happening in that process that just needs to be dropped, regardless of what the content was. And so I'd never seen just the uniformity of the connection process-wise beneath the content, whether it's thinking about, food or something trivial, or thinking about something, weighty or philosophical. It's still an attachment to thought. It's still at the process level the same. And I just needed to relax my mind. And so it was quite an extraordinary intervention on his part, because it actually just completely resolved my existential angst. And I really don't feel like I've had any since then, which is pretty extraordinary. And I have so much gratitude towards him for his very simple but very powerful teaching. So after Korea, I came back to college, to finish college. I had, at the time, I did have an interest in mental health, so I was starting to think about becoming a therapist, but then I really became passionate about art and sculpture. And so when I graduated college, that's really where I focused my energy. So I had a number of different jobs in the art, fabrication and sculpture, fabrication and project managing world. This was in Boston. And then I moved to Iowa City with my fiance at the time. And that began another chapter of my life that was very painful. Iowa City was really isolating for me, at least initially. I did start to make some friends, but I was just so focused on trying to develop my portfolio as an artist because I wanted to get into graduate school. And so I was spending vast numbers of hours in my garage just working in these solitary projects. And then I was working at this bronze foundry at the time where I would just spend hours a day by myself making these silicone molds or welding things or grinding bronze down. It was really, yeah. And it was a grind, quite literally and metaphorically. And yeah, I remember feeling just so lonely and so lost. And then I got married, and then my marriage also fell apart. So my wife cheated on me just about 4 months after we got married, which was just devastating. And yeah, it was just like a really messy time of my life where I just felt like the ground dropped out from under me, and I didn't know what I was going to do or where I was going to go next with my life. I was getting really burned out with art because it felt like it was very wrapped up in my ego. It was very isolating. It also, as somebody who's just has a history of chronic overthinking, all this time by myself, working with my hands, was just not engaging my mind enough. So I was feeling just really lost, like career-wise. My relationship had just gone up in flames, and I was still just nursing my wounds from that whole ordeal. But then I did some soul searching, and I kind of went back to a passion that I had for mental health, which goes back to high school, when I was first started to do my own therapy and finding that helpful and thinking maybe I could do this someday. I volunteered at a suicide and crisis hotline in Boston, and when I was in college. And so I kind of just thought, maybe I need to leave art behind. Maybe this is just like a big ego attachment for me, and I need to do something much more about service, about helping others. And so I decided to go to social work school, and that was a huge turn for me in a completely different direction. And that was really satisfying. That felt like, okay, I'm finally kind of coming into my own and coming into clarity about my career direction. And especially when I started to do my internships and working with clients, I was finding this work very satisfying and very engaging. And yeah, intellectually engaging, emotionally engaging, just really heart opening. And I thought, okay, I've really found my career path. This is what I was really meant to do, is to be a healer, to be a therapist. And yeah, I took that very far, and I started to combine my meditation practice in with my therapy, and got really excited about some of these modalities, such as mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, which explicitly weave mindfulness and meditation into the therapeutic interventions. And so I started to, in my internships at the VA in particular, that was probably the most influential, starting to do acceptance and commitment therapy groups. And then when I started to work at the local university here in Corvallis, with Oregon State University, I did a lot of mindfulness and meditation, both individually and in groups. And yeah, I felt really satisfied. I felt, and I also started a new relationship. I got married, remarried, and yeah, to just an amazing woman who I'm so grateful to be in partnership with, and I have an amazing stepdaughter. So everything was really going well for me. Like my family life had come together, my career direction had blossomed, but I felt this sense of incompleteness at a spiritual level. And I think it had to do with my relationship with meditation and with my own mind, because the Zen tradition that I had been part of really emphasized, I would say, some people might disagree, but a somewhat aversive relationship with thinking. Zen Master Songsan, the founder of the Kwan Um school, used to say, tell your backseat driver to shut up. And so the backseat driver being this metaphor for your mind, your monkey mind, that needs to be somehow tamed or shut down or ignored. And so that's what I've been doing for years with my mind, is just trying to ignore it, to shut it down, to kind of quash it and just come to, focus here, now, this. And it was very exhausting, and there was some shame there and some performance, and I felt like I was really hard on myself, and I just felt like my practice was just really, really dry and didn't have any juice to it, and I just hit a wall there. And this was in 2018. And around that same time, I started to read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, about psychedelics. And growing up as a fundamentalist Christian, I feel like I still retained this kind of sense of anti-substance. And I didn't feel that was going to be my path. And I even looked down upon people I knew who had used psychedelics as some kind of spiritual opening tool. I thought it was some kind of cheat. or somehow illegitimate in some way. But yeah, when I read Michael Pollan's book, somehow the timing just seemed right, and I just felt the sense of openness, and I thought, yeah, I want to try this. And it just so happened that a friend of mine had access to some mushrooms, and so we planned this trip where we did mushrooms together, and we didn't really know what we were doing. We were just amateurs. But I definitely, even on a very small dose, it was about 1.5 grams, had this very, very profound opening where it just became very obvious to me that everything is made of consciousness. Not that I know what that is or what the nature of consciousness is, but I'm using that as a kind of term of art for just the nature of experience being sensory. Your direct experience being a unified sensory field. The sensorium, you could say. That was just so clear and obvious. And suddenly all these things that I read from Zen Master Sungsan's texts, such as, the mind makes the world and things like that, or there's no inside, no outside. It just became obvious because, of course, this is all consciousness. Like the experience is unfolding in the theater of consciousness, and it has no inherent borders or boundaries except ones that are constructed. That was just really, really clear to me. And it just really brought together these two different parts of my brain, I feel like, because I was always very interested in the sense that that our experience unfolds in consciousness. I knew that intellectually. I was very drawn to the Matrix, when I was growing up, and just philosophically thinking about, like, what if I were a brain in a jar? How would I know? That sort of thing. So I had that in my mind, and then I had Zen, and I had never thought to myself that actually what Zen is talking about, this sense of waking up or seeing that life is like a dream or everything is one, it's actually the same thing, just experienced experientially. You could say that it's like the experiential recognition of like representationalism, this idea that everything is just a representation in consciousness. And yeah, that just really clicked for me. At the time as well, I was starting to get interested in the work of Michael Taft and nonduality. And he had this amazing essay. It's called something like Towards a Unified Theory of Non-Dual Awakening or something like that. And he talks about this explicitly. He says, if you think about it, like you're as far as we know from neuroscience, your brain is this predictive processing machine. It's taking sensations, it's processing them, it's creating this simulation, this representation in your mind, and that is your experience. And one of the ways to describe non-duality, at least through this frame, which isn't the only frame, but it's a frame, is the experiential recognition of that. Just noticing that, when I'm looking around at things, I'm not looking at the actual atomic thing. This water bottle isn't the actual water bottle. This is a representation in my mind. And so everything is like a lucid dream. And that just became really obvious on mushrooms, which was, just such a relief and so exciting. And that just got me really interested in moving beyond this meditation practice of trying to squish my mind into submission into a meditation practice that was about openness and expansion and relaxing the mind. And so I got really interested in these Mahamudra and Dzogchen ways of practicing. And I started to experiment more with mushrooms in particular and just experience just profound spiritual openings and rapid psychological healings. I remember this one trip in particular, maybe on a couple grams of mushrooms, where I just felt all of my childhood angst and just sort of rotten feelings towards my family from just ways I felt like I'd been mistreated or there was some kind of injustice against me or just feeling like a black sheep of the family. And all of that antipathy just dissolved very quickly. And it never really came back again in the same form. It was like some kind of knot of tension in my body and in my mind that just completely dissolved into this radiant light and love. And it completely transformed my relationship with my family. It's never been the same. I feel like I've done so much inner healing, and that's allowed me to be in connection with them as an adult. And after that, after the seeing the spiritual kind of openings, the heart opening and healing, I just knew that psychedelics was what I had to do with my life as a healer. If I was going to be a therapist, I just could not overlook the profound healing potential of these medicines. And so I knew that that's what I had to do with my life. And I did more experiments with different substances. So 5-MeO DMT was a huge opener for me, and really just crystallizing that sense of non-duality, that really just felt sense of the oneness of everything. And that was definitely a shift for me. Another one is Salvia divinorum, which I'll talk about more later. Even after my 5-MeO experiences, I still felt like there was some blockage in terms of really having non-duality be active in a felt sense on a day-to-day basis, like having it be my new operating system. And Salvia divinorum, of all things, I say of all things because a lot of people are skeptical of it, or just scared of it, or experience it dysphorically somehow. But I had this really powerful experience with Salvia, pretty high dose, where I experienced a complete slow motion dissolution of all of my sensory experience, almost like everything was in a blender, a slow motion blender. And then there was a cessation. There was an increase in energy, and suddenly a kind of like a dropping out of consciousness, a coming back. And after that, I just knew that everything was one. It just felt as obvious as just looking at different parts of the same blanket and just knowing that it's all part of the same fabric. Just that obvious, that textural, that felt. I just, knew that the field of consciousness was unified, and that there was no center to it, and no separate perceiver, and no separate inside or outside, and that if those things are arising, they're all constructs. So I'm really thankful to Salvia divinorum for providing that insight. So I continued to just investigate all of these things, and I left Oregon State University, and I knew I needed to go into private practice because that was the only place that I could do this work. And so I started doing integration work. So I wasn't serving any medicines at that time, but I was helping people integrate their psychedelic experiences as a therapist. And this was during COVID, so I was doing all of this over Zoom. I had, in my experiments on my own, something difficult that came up. I was having so much momentum and so much enthusiasm, and I hadn't really had anything that I would consider like a bad trip, so-called, or a challenging trip. It felt like each new medicine just opened me deeper into more love and more kind of radiance and excitement and exuberance and healing. But everything changed for me when I took mushrooms with lion's mane. So this is something called the Stamets stack from Paul Stamets, combining mushrooms, lion's mane, and usually it's done with niacin. And this is usually in kind of a microdose kind of way. I was not very careful and was doing a bit higher doses with mushrooms and with lion's mane. And little did I know that lion's mane, even though for many people it's very medicinal and healing, and it's part of traditional Chinese medicine, for a small percentage of the population, there seems to be a very dramatic reaction to lion's mane, a strongly inflammatory response that can be just devastating, just debilitating. And I am one of those people. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it has to do with the Lyme disease, the babesia. I also have tested positive for something called mast cell activation syndrome, which essentially means your body is in a heightened, almost like a hair trigger inflammatory kind of state. So you're subject to inflammatory attacks very easily because your mast cell system is out of balance and overactivated. And so it could have been, it could be that I have some underlying mushroom or mold allergy. I do have a penicillin allergy, which is, derived from mold. So I don't know exactly what it was, but clearly there's some kind of sensitivity I have to lion's mane, because it just completely destroyed, I feel like, my neurocognitive capacity for about at least 2 years. It was really hard. It felt like someone had poured molasses into my brain. All of my cognitive processes were just dramatically slowed down. I had trouble with short-term memory, with long-term memory. I would just forget everyday words. I would forget the rules of driving. Driving became very challenging. Just watching TV, reading, having conversations. I felt like I was having some kind of aphasia where English no longer made sense to me in certain ways. I had to obsessively Google phrases when I'd be writing or when I'd be speaking, because nothing sounded right to me anymore. And so my brain was just really, I would imagine, just in a state of strong inflammation. And yeah, that was just really, really hard. I don't even know how I got through that while continuing to work. Somehow I was just faking it, essentially, fake it till you make it, still doing my therapy sessions, but really feeling like I was redlining it cognitively, just trying to make it through. It was just, yeah, really, really challenging. But, my experience with brain damage or brain inflammation has been that even though it's been some of the hardest and most traumatic things that I've gone through, it's also been some of the most insightful opportunities in terms of just seeing how your mind works and seeing how I can eke out some kind of new relationship with consciousness or with my thoughts or with my mind through the inflammation. And this lion's mane proved to be an interesting opportunity for that. And actually, I feel like I, in the end, got a lot out of it, even though it was really torturous at times. And a couple of those things that I'll mention. One is that this was the beginning of my blossoming and opening of my gender identity. So something that was an interesting sequela of the lion's mane is that because I had this aphasia thing, I felt like ordinary words and identifications just became very, very nebulous and fuzzy. So when I would ask myself, well, who am I? Usually there would be this kind of ready-made set of descriptors, right? Like I'm cis, white and male and heterosexual and so forth. And of course, in social work school, we looked so deeply at identities and intersecting identities. And so that was very on the tip of my tongue. But with the lion's mane, it all became very fuzzy. And so words such as man or male or, heterosexual or cisgender, it all just felt very amorphous. Like, what does that even mean? Like, who am I? It's almost like my identity became very fluid and clay-like. And so, yeah, that really prompted me to investigate and look inward and ask myself, well, who am I really? I mean, what feels right to me at kind of an intuitive level, energetically? What is my gender? What is my sexual orientation? And the answers that came up for me were so much more expansive and fluid than I ever realized. And I started to identify as non-binary. I started to experiment with pronouns, eventually settling on she, her pronouns. And I started to wear dresses and skirts, things that would be considered like women's clothing. I consider that a social construct. I don't think fashion has any inherent gender. But I just felt more comfortable embracing these different forms of expression. And it felt like near to my experience and comfortable. And it just felt good. It felt like me. And yeah, so that was a huge outcome of the lion's mane. And thankfully, the neurocognitive kind of sludge did start to dredge out and kind of fall away. There's still some, that was like, 4 years ago or so now. Still some traces of it, but a lot of it has dissipated. But the other interesting outcome of lion's mane is that it really changed how I relate to psychedelics and how I relate to journeying and tripping and what I call unjourneying. And what happened was there was this one particular mushroom trip where this is, post lion's mane, right? And I was taking a break from any kind of psychedelics because I was scared of what was happening to me at a neurological level. And, but I decided to return to mushrooms just as an experiment. And I did, I don't know, maybe it was like a gram or so. And I remember putting on some eye shades and headphones, and I was looking forward to having this nice trip and just, dissolving into the fractals. And I was listening to music and so forth. And it just didn't happen. as I was accustomed to. So I just like hit a wall. It felt like my brain just could not trip at all. And I was initially just devastated. Like, oh my God, is this the end of my ability to have psychedelic experiences? But then something came to my mind, which is this old story of Neem Karoli Baba, who was Ram Dass's guru. And supposedly, I mean, nobody knows if this story is apocryphal or not, but Ram Dass certainly swore by it, that on at least 2 occasions, he gave Neem Karoli Baba some LSD, and there was little to no psychoactive impact or effect on Neem Karoli Baba. And the understanding being that his mind was already so kind of open and present and expansive that whatever the LSD was doing wasn't really disruptive to his experience. And so that anecdote came to my mind as I was in this mushroom trip. And all of a sudden, even though I couldn't travel elsewhere, I did feel this sense of radical presence, this radical nowness and here-ness, unlike ever before. And I thought to myself, this is interesting. Maybe this is the in the limit of the psychedelic path. Maybe this is what happens, where if you continue to meditate, it actually, rather than having all these bedazzling light show kind of experiences or traveling elsewhere, like it actually crystallizes into just this, like just the experience of your sensations arising moment by moment as they are. And that actually, over time, that means that they're having less and less of an effect. And Neem Karoli Baba may be kind of the deep end of the pool there in terms of someone who's so, has done so much practice that the effect is quite minimal, even of a high dose. So I just kind of started to play with that. And this became my new psychedelic path, is when I trip, when I take medicine, I'm not going to trip. Part of it is felt like neurologically it was just very difficult. There was a blockage there, but also there was this energy and passion I was feeling about how can I really meditate on the medicine. And so one of the metaphors I like to give with this is imagining the arising of a psychedelic almost like a wave, like a big wave coming in. And it feels like there's 3 different responses you can have to the wave. So one is to like fight the wave, which would be classically like what we would call like resistance, psychologically or in a psychedelic space. Like you're resisting the medicine, you're fighting it. And that doesn't seem to be very helpful. It seems to just cause more tension in the body and more kind of suffering. Another would be just dropping all resistance, just surrendering, right? And just letting the wave wash over you. And this may be very useful. Maybe this is a sort of stage of psychedelic practice. Certainly that's how I was taught by my guides and how I first approached medicine, is just you let the wave wash over you. You just dissolve into the ocean, especially at high doses or with something like 5-MeO-DMT, and you just become one, and then that's it. And then you come back. But this unjourneying process, inspired by Neem Karoli Baba, I would liken it to kind of like surfing, where there is some kind of offering of, you might call it a kind of resistance, but it's like more like a flow, I could say. Instead of just allowing the wave to completely dissolve you, you are, in a sense, channeling the energy of the psychedelic into a kind of presence, a kind of mindfulness practice, using the medicine, if it's wanting to pull you away, almost like a kind of resistance training, like a resistance band or sort of like swimming, or lifting weights. So you're actually strengthening, you might say, like your kind of mindfulness muscles, your ability to just be in the present and just surf the energy of the medicine without capsizing or without just dissolving. And so this is what I started to do. And ayahuasca was a very effective tool for this. I started to do this with 5-MeO-DMT. And in my experiments, I got to, I would say moderate doses, what they call like the 1 to 4 pen. Usually when this is administered in these stepwise doses, you have a 1 to 8 pen, a 1 to 4, 1 to 2. And so the 1 to 4 is sort of like a mid-range dose. And I remember doing experiments with that pen and essentially having nothing happen. Maybe a little bit of increased heart rate, maybe my palms sweating a little bit, but not really feeling like I was going anywhere, like I was leaving the plane. Like anything psychoactive was really happening. Just this feeling of, I'm just here. This is sensations are doing what they're doing. And Yes, and so that effectively is what I mean by unjourneying. It's essentially having a different orientation to medicine, the surfing orientation, instead of just straight up surrender, or instead of having some intention to travel elsewhere or to have some kind of exciting or exotic or entity or other experiences. It's about actively meditating, maybe even being in formal meditation posture with the medicine and allowing it to just sort of massage your mind into more and more and more presence and openness to the point where it's actually having less and less of an effect. And so the point is not to continue to journey, but to, have the medicine do what medicine does. Like essentially, medicine should when it heals you, you shouldn't need the medicine anymore. And so, kind of moving towards a place where psychedelics become less and less necessary. Yeah, of course. I mean, with this metaphor being unnecessary, medicine being unnecessary, there's certainly some cases I can imagine where people might have a chronic condition where that might not apply. So I just wanted to state that. But yeah, I guess I feel like with psychedelics, it feels like they shouldn't necessarily have to be used indefinitely. That there could be some kind of progressive path where through integration, the psychedelic experience just is becoming your everyday experience. Your everyday experience is feeling more and more alive and vibrant, as if you're on a psychedelic, but that's just your experience. Sensations are doing what they're doing, and they're alive and they're connected. So this is how I'm defining Unjourneying, which is kind of the centerpiece of this podcast and this YouTube channel and my practice in its current state. So with the Unjourneying as my new kind of direction, I decided at some point to start training as a guide. So I started to do this shift from just doing integration to actually starting to serve medicine. First, it was with mushrooms. And then I started to move away from mushrooms, first of all, because I realized I have a mushroom allergy. And so I couldn't have a personal connection with it. But I also realized that other medicines seemed to be much more instrumental and much more fast-acting and effective for this kind of unjourneying work. And the three in particular that I tend to work with are 5-MeO-DMT and N-DMT, and that can be combined with an MAO inhibitor to form an ayahuasca analog or analog ayahuasca, you could call it. And then finally, Salvia, divinorum. And so I trained, my training was with Inner Trek, which is based here in Oregon as a mushroom guide. And then I also have had the opportunity to train in the underground with providers, especially with 5-MeO and what's called the stepwise method. I actually was able to train with the creators of that method. And that was a really beautiful experience, just, seeing them guide us through these different steps, working with these pens, the 1 to 8, 1 to 4, 1 to 2, etc. And everything was going well. I feel like, again, I had this moment of like, okay, things are shaping up as they often do before entropy kicks in, right? I had my practice. I was serving. I was experimenting with these different medicines, and everything seemed to be going well. And then I had this year of just violent inflammation that arose from 5-MeO-DMT, which is a medicine that seemed to have treated me well before. It wasn't like mushrooms, or it wasn't like, in some cases, ayahuasca would be contaminated with mold, and I was having these allergic reactions to that. 5-MeO seemed to be kind to me. Sometimes maybe a little bit of inflammation, but nothing too challenging. But this one particular day, I took a dose of it, and it just kicked off this wave of neurological inflammation, and it felt like nervous system irritation. I'm not sure exactly what was going on, but it felt like my vagus nerve just got really inflamed. Like I was having like chest pains and then these like stabbing headaches. I can still feel some of those symptoms right now in the aftermath of that. Even though it's been, coming up on 1.5 years, 2 years, I think, since that incident. But really challenging, really shocking. And again, I don't know why I have these strange reactions, except that I suspect it has something to do with the Lyme, the babesia in particular. Babesiosis tends to really affect the nervous system and cause neuroinflammation and nervous system irritation. So yeah, I don't know, but I suspect that it seems like somehow my serotonin system is very hypersensitized, and if I'm using certain medicines, especially more powerful ones like 5-MeO, sometimes there can be this. It can be healing, but it can be dancing this line between healing and exacerbation and increasing the inflammation. That's what happened with the 5-MeO. And this isn't unheard of in the community. I mean, there are people with MS, for example, who have reported that 5-MeO can be inflammatory for them. So it is, if you do have a chronic neurological condition, neuroinflammatory condition, or autoimmune condition, yeah, it's good to be careful with these medicines because you don't know whether they could help or they could hurt. So during this year of inflammation after the 5, it felt like, yeah, my vagus nerve perhaps, or my serotonin system was just really dysregulated, really out of whack. And so I was getting all these like headaches and brain fog. And but what was more devastating was the dysphoria. Somehow my serotonin system felt so dysregulated. It took me back to high school when I was coming off of Effexor and just having these really bad withdrawal symptoms. It felt like that, but for a year, where almost on a daily basis, I just felt miserable, dysphoric, and yeah, it was hard. I felt really sometimes a sense of hopelessness. I didn't know if this was going to be my new normal, like permanently. Had I broken my brain essentially? And it also was interesting because it felt like my contact with non-duality was still there, but the usual kind of attributes of non-duality in terms of this sense of openness and vividness and presence, and some people would say even, a sense of joy or happiness, being sort of the natural state of things, a sense of bliss, that felt very eroded and compromised, and because I was just so miserable. And and as with, as I've said before, with all of my encounters with inflammation or brain damage, there's this intense suffering, but then there's this moment where I feel like I do have an opportunity to learn something new at a spiritual level or personal level that is transformative. And that's again what happened with this year of intense inflammation. Like I say year because that was the worst of it. I still have some echoes, but most of it dissipated after about a year. And it all happened to me, this shift, when I was sitting in meditation and I was feeling so frustrated because I could feel what I was accustomed to with non-duality, but also this feeling of dysphoria and brain fog. And I was just so frustrated. And it just suddenly hit me, I am attached to non-duality. I'm attached to these certain attributes of consciousness, and ultimately attached to happiness. I feel like so often with spiritual teachings in the non-dual space, there is this sort of promise that you can get to some point where you just don't suffer anymore, or that once you realize the true nature of reality, you'll realize it is happiness, and then that'll just be your natural state. There's no self, there's no suffering, et cetera, et cetera. And I still had some of that. I was still attached to that, and I still was attached to my own personal liberation. And I was sitting there on the meditation cushion, just, essentially trying to meditate, but feeling this blockage and this frustration. And it just hit me all of a sudden, like I'm attached to non-duality. I'm attached to certain qualities of my experience, but my experience is just happening as it is, like without my control. And that's just the nature of what's happening in this moment. And it just so happens that is dysphoria and certain negative thoughts and certain inflammatory feelings in my head. And that's just what's happening. And this was very interesting because I realized that perhaps non-duality, and I realize people use that term in a lot of different ways, but there's a certain limitation to it. Now, my point of contact with non-duality is mostly through some contemporary teachers such as Michael Taft and Peter Fenner, and reading some of Peter Fenner's translation of Longchen, and my hopefully I'm not pigeonholing Dzogchen in a unfair way, but I feel like when I read Longchen, at least in translation, there is this kind of exuberance. There's a lot of adjectives that repeat a lot, such as like pristine and liberated and blissful and things like that. And so there is some sense of when you wake up in this Dzogchen sense and you cultivate this certain state, that it's going to feel free and it's going to feel open, it's going to feel spacious, it's going to feel bright and pristine and liberated. And that sounds great. And I think you can get to a point where you do cultivate that. And I had gotten to a point where I felt a lot of that a lot of the time. But it's not, in my opinion, it's not the unconditioned. It's still conditional. It's still somehow grounded in a certain kind of neurological activity and neurotransmitter kind of activity. And what happens when there's some kind of insult to the brain or assault to the skull or some kind of traumatic brain injury that disrupts that whole system, or if you have meningitis or you have some kind of chronic inflammatory condition like mine, that particular delicate brain chemistry that's creating all those different states of bliss might become disrupted. And then what are you going to do? And this is where I was spiritually, of like, okay, I feel like I've lost some contact with the beauty of non-duality, but here I am still having a conscious experience. And so I started to let go, I guess you could say, of my attachment to non-duality, and starting to have an interest just in connection with the moment, whatever it was, whether it was dual or non-dual, whether I was feeling miserable or blissful, just noticing this is exactly what's happening as it is. And also recognizing that I don't have any control whether I'm noticing that or not, or whether I'm having that insight or not. It's all just happening kind of spontaneously. And this is when I got more interested in Salvia divinorum and returning to Salvia divinorum. That was partly out of a process of elimination, because I realized that if I wanted to continue to work with psychedelic medicine, everything that affected my serotonin system was exacerbating my inflammation. So I thought, well, if I'm going to continue to explore psychedelics, I need to work with something that is, doesn't target the serotonin receptors, which salvinorin A, hits the kappa opioid receptors. It's an agonist of those receptors. So I thought this should be safe for my brain. So I started to work with it, and Salvia, interestingly enough, seemed to confirm for me some contact with something else that felt different than non-duality, at least as I had experienced it in my spiritual path. Like, it felt like non-duality and 5-MeO-DMT and N-DMT all seem to align along some kind of optimization of the serotonergic system of the brain, or if I practice in a certain way and use those medicines, everything would come together into this feeling of an open, spacious dream, kind of non-dual dreamscape that was very vivid and bright. And yeah, with that, a sense of exuberance or radiance and excitement and freedom and so forth and so on. And something that I could, cultivate and on a day-to-day basis feel that a lot of the time, but it was never there 100% of the time. Sometimes it would drop out, or sometimes I would, not be in contact with that. With Salvia, it feels like, at least for me, something different happens where there's just some sense of this experience, these sensations are unfolding exactly as they are in whatever configuration they are. And there's not a separate, I have no control over that whatsoever. So whether a moment is deeply mired in duality and separation and rumination, or whether it is open and spacious and free, that is what is happening in that moment. So there is sort of no true underlying nature of the mind or ground of being. The only thing you could really say about the mind is that it's a predictive processing machine that's just producing whatever subjective experience it is at that particular moment. And Salvia just feels, for me at least, that it crystallizes that at this moment, this is what's happening. And at this moment, this is what's happening. And in some ways, the interest that I'd had for many years in non-duality, awakening, liberation, happiness, all these things, like, kind of go out the window, because it's just this feeling of all of that is predicated on this idea of a spiritual practitioner who somehow, has free will to practice, to attain, to get somewhere. And it feels like Salvia sort of, how can I say, opens up or unpacks like free will as a kind of illusion. And yeah, in the sense of like practice and a practitioner, all of these things as these kind of constructs. And really all that's happening is sensations are doing what they're doing without your input, as some kind of separate controller spontaneously. Sight, sound, smells, sensations, mental sensations. And there's no control. There's no control over any of it. And of course, I don't know if any of this is actually true. It's just a feeling that I have on Salvia that I bring into my day-to-day life as a kind of integration. But it's just really interesting. It feels like a different axis of, I don't even want to call it awakening, just of like insight or experience that feels orthogonal to the serotonergic, what I associate with the serotonergic aspect of awakening, of Dzogchen, of non-duality. There's this kind of kappa opioid, perhaps, like this is my pet theory, axis of awakening, of insight, where, yeah, it's even hard to put into words because I feel like I'm still integrating it. This is still my work that I'm doing with Salvia currently. But it just feels like, yeah, everything that was important to me spiritually about trying to cultivate a certain quality of my experience that was very bright and open and liberated, all of that just feels like it goes out the window because I'm just faced with this crushing, I don't know how to describe it. Yeah, just sort of like realization that it's like everything is just frozen in carbonite. It's time to stop in Salvia. And there's this feeling of, oh my God, everything that I thought I was doing as a spiritual practitioner is just happening on its own. There is no control. And so liberation, spiritual practice, these things just feel irrelevant. Or if they're happening, that's also what's happening in that moment. Whatever's happening is happening. And that's just really interesting to me. That's just kind of where I am now. It feels in alignment with this kind of unjourneying, that I'm not trying to cultivate any particular kind of experience in meditation or psychedelics, but just having insight into that experience is happening on its own as it is. And yeah, it's just really fascinating. And I'd love to share more about this with you in conversation if you want to connect with me. So that leads me kind of to now, like right here in this moment. What am I doing? What am I passionate about? Why am I starting this channel? So my practice now is I am a psychotherapist. I am also a transformational coach, which helps me work with people, not just in Oregon, because if I'm working within a social work, licensure, psychotherapy context, it needs to be within the state lines. But I can work anywhere in the world with anybody under a coaching aegis. And I'm also a guide. So I also serve medicine to people, and I weave these things together. So I do pre-integration, serve the medicine, post-integration. And I am really passionate about working with people who are interested in healing from trauma of any kind. I'm interested in working with queer people who are exploring their gender identity, but that's not sort of a niche that is exclusive to anybody else. So I love working with people across the spectrum of gender and sexuality, and I do individual retreats. I also do couples retreats. I can also do, small groups. I can do all sorts of just custom things. I do half-day retreats, full-day retreats, and this can be with any of these medicines. So I do serve mushrooms to people who really want to, but I'm definitely much more passionate and specialized these days in working with 5-MeO-DMT and N-DMT. Like I said, that can be combined with an MAO inhibitor to form an analog ayahuasca. And also my current obsession is Salvia divinorum. If you're going to start exploring these medicines for the first time, I definitely recommend starting with 5-MeO before you do any of the other ones, because that one I think is the easiest to start with, especially if we work in a progressive way. So yeah, that's what I'm doing. And I decided to start this YouTube channel and this podcast because I just wanted to have more connective conversations with people around the world about these topics and just kind of get the message out there about what I'm doing, and also about this unjourneying way of working, which is I would say somewhat alternative. There's a big emphasis with psychedelics on having big experiences, traveling elsewhere, meeting entities, or maybe doing these like deep dive, heart-opening journeys into childhood and stuff like that. And I want to be clear that I don't think any of that is bad or wrong or anything like that. And it's actually, I think, part of the process. I think you have to, maybe you don't, but I think you probably have to journey before you unjourney. At least that was my experience. You really have to clean out your psychic basement. And you do have to go back into your childhood and have these kind of regressions and let go of these attachment wounds and heal these traumas. But yeah, once the psychic basement is sort of clear, if you will, and a lot of this trauma has been released, I think there is this new capacity to approach this work with a new kind of lightness and a meditative presence to, instead of having the wave just sweep you over, try surfing it and seeing what happens. So I'm excited about introducing this Unjourneying, seeing how it resonates with people, and seeing who else out there is doing this kind of work. So I'm envisioning this channel, this podcast, as a way to connect with potential clients, to connect with colleagues, to make friends, to make community. And I'll be doing some of these episodes on my own. I'll be doing some interviews with people to talk about these topics. And I'm just super excited and jazzed and about it all. And if you want to connect with me more, you can visit my website. So it's unjourneying.com. And you can read more about me there and my work. And if you want to work with me, there's a form there that I have for prospective clients. It should be really easy to find. It's right on the main page and several other pages. There's a link there. And you can fill out a form and you get a 50-minute consultation with me. And we can, do a deep dive together into what you want to work on, what you want to open up and shift and heal, and we'll figure out how to do that. So thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to being in connection with you soon. So please reach out. Thank you.